Okay, are we seeing my slides? Right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Then I'll move along. Thanks, Tabitha, for the introduction. I'm excited to be presenting this session, and I really appreciate being invited to present this or having my proposal accepted to present this. And I'm eager to talk about how, during a time where we're all socially distanced and feeling more isolated, we might be able to be more capable of connecting remotely to each other in a time that maybe is allowing us some opportunities for reflection on our programs and how we might be able to improve them. And so I hope that I'm able to provide one pathway towards not only strengthening communities of practice during an isolated time, but also a methodology to create a roadmap for building on our digital preservation programs at our institutions. And so I'm going to cover my agenda, do a little acknowledgement, and then jump right into the content of how to conduct a digital preservation peer assessment. So as I was just saying, the top line that we'll be covering is the overview of the assessment. What is contained in a digital preservation peer assessment? What are some tools and resources you can use to facilitate assessing digital preservation practices at a peer's institution? We'll go over the facets and the content covered within an assessment, but then we'll pivot on over to strategies for making a peer assessment, which was originally designed for on-site peer assessments, work in a remote context for digital preservation peer assessment. And so I'll share a bunch of strategies, even share like a sample agenda for what remote assessments might look like with your peer. And at the end, I'll share the key resources that make these types of assessments possible and help you to carry these out with your peers. And I'll open up the floor to questions. I want to make sure I acknowledge a few key organizations and individuals that made this peer assessment model, digital preservation peer assessment model, possible. I want to point out that in December 2016, it was when NEDCC was awarded a National Endowment for the Humanities Preservation and Access Education and Training Grant to prepare and present a collaborative digital preservation assessment training program that resulted in the publications and the assessment model that I'm going to share today. And while NEDCC was the lead, we invited lyricists to collaborate with us and expand our capabilities on offering digital preservation assessments. And some of the most important staff members were former senior preservation specialist Francis Harrell at NEDCC, and also Annie Peterson at Lyrasis, and they were really key in making this assessment model possible. So shout out to them. And now I'm going to talk about the assessment content. What does it look like to do an assessment? What are the types of questions a digital preservation assessment answers? And where does it fit in the planning ecosystem? And that's going to be our first slide that I want to cover. An assessment, including digital preservation assessments, fit within the broader preservation planning that we do as an organization. And it really is the start. Assessments are not only just about evaluating what's going on, but also getting a sense of the context of an institution. What's the organizational structure like? What are the collections that are currently in existence? What are the objectives for the organization? Then where are current practices at, and how do we compare those to best and good practices in the field? Now, once the assessment is conducted and information is gathered about current practices, recent history, the existing collections and future goals, we prioritize recommendations for improvement and building on current successes. When these strategies for improvement are prioritized, it's often done in short, medium, and long-term goals with very urgent activities and affordable or accessible activities in the short term, and larger, maybe resource-intensive or planning-heavy activities in the long term. And then midterm is kind of a nice in-between of those two things. It really amounts to a roadmap for improvement, but it's not just about prioritizing recommendations or strategies for improvement. It's about applying needed resources to those priorities. And so if we look at a solution like acquiring a license to Preservica or some kind of...
Sean, you've gone mute.
Oh, no. Can you hear me now? How about now? Can you hear me?
Sean, I'm able to hear you. Can others hear him?
Okay, now.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, thanks. I think I'm gesticulating a lot, and I may have hit the mute button on my microphone, so I apologize for that. Okay, so thinking about how we allocate resources, needed resources for these prioritized recommendations, we think not only about the cost of licenses for software or new storage media, but we also think about staff in terms of the skills they have and what skills they need to build, or maybe we lack the number of staff needed. And we also have to factor in the time it will take for them to complete activities, even if they don't have a direct cost associated with those activities. Once this is done, you're ready to advocate for action. And this process, I mean, we're always advocating for improvements to our digital preservation programs, but we're much better advocates when we've done the assessment, done the prioritization, and then allocated needed resources in a long-term plan. And it is even more effective when you've gotten a peer to do it, because you can do self-assessment. That's nice. It's very important too to always be thinking about how you could improve personally. But I think to have a peer come in, brainstorm with you, and act as a third party can enhance your advocacy efforts. So that's where the assessment really fits into the bigger picture. And of course, then we just go about assessing again once we've made progress on our activities and the time has come. We see where we've gone and where we need to go, and the iterative process continues. Now, what are the logistical aspects of an assessment look like? How do we do the assessment? There's two options. There's interviews, which are very important and a kind of a standard way to do assessments, where one team or one individual peer goes to a peer institution and goes through the facets of the assessment and asks relevant questions in those assessment facets, makes observations, and then gives prioritized recommendations. It's a very standard way, and it's the one we'll be thinking most about, but there's also co-assessment, where representative groups from each organization come together, or individuals from each organization come together one-on-one, and they go by facet of the assessment and say, okay, in the area of technological resources, what do you have? What do you need? What do I have? And what do I need? And you compare and contrast, and this is good for benchmarking and really dynamic conversations of skill building and resource identification, needed resources. Those are two options, but we'll focus on the interview one for today. And I'll just say you can always trim the scope of your assessment. It doesn't have to be as big as what I'm about to show you. And you can focus on just one area if that's all you can allocate time for. Now, looking at those assessment facets, we break them down into 5 categories, and I'll expand on each. But the fact that we're covering background information about the organization and its structure, and then thinking about staff and resources, and then transitioning into more of like a policy infrastructure, and then the procedures we follow, and then the technological resources available, shows you how comprehensive these assessments are. And they take into account the practical, like the storage media you have and the workflows you have for managing digital content, all the way up to the larger things about institutional decision-making, really show you how much of a big picture, wide view this assessment method is. In the organizational section, we're not only gaining information, and I've got my mouse here to sort of highlight a few things I'm looking at here. We're not only thinking just about sort of what the collections are that exist in the organization that are in a digital format, but we're also thinking about how does the organizational structure of the institution provide support for digital preservation. We need to think about all the stakeholders in many departments, and is there some sort of interdepartmental decision-making body for digital preservation? We may also think about strategic planning. Is this the first time an assessment has ever happened? How much do we think about 5 years down the road for our digital program? We think about how things like our mission connect to digital preservation, and if it's, digital preservation is documented as a part of our mission. We think about what type of audience we have in a designated community and what our strengths are as an organization. And we really highlight that here because it's so important to not only find out what needs work, but also what is working well. Beyond the organization, we think about staff and resources, things like what are the training gaps that exist, because we're all still learning about digital preservation. constantly. We think about what are the available financial resources. We think about if staffing is like or digital preservation is an ad hoc thing that is done when time allows, or if it's an official role of a person. And we think about if people are engaging in communities of practice and working in networks to improve their procedures and learn more about practices that are appropriate for their organization. In the area of policy infrastructure, you learn about how collection development policies are conducive or not conducive to digital preservation, and what selection strategies exist to decide what should be digitized and what should not. And lastly, thinking about preservation plans. Do we have an overall workflow for how we prioritize the care of one content and care for one type of content over another? And so those types of policies also support our digital preservation program. We think in terms of the workflows and the procedures around what types of procedures exist for reformatting, what types of procedures exist for born digital objects. How do you extract born digital content off of old floppy drives? Thinking about metadata, what types of schema are we using? And are we just collecting descriptive metadata, or are we collecting preservation metadata that helps us manage digital content over the long term? And then how well do we document all of the above? Do we have procedures and manuals for these things written down, or is it kind of something that we do just something out of our heads that we figured out that works, but we haven't written it down? I want to touch on the last one, which I think is of a lot of interest to most organizations thinking of doing assessments. What are the technological resources available to us? But before we get into storage and things like that, we look at the relationship that archives have to their IT department. Is it one in which IT leads and the archives follows? Is it one in which the archives or library is a collaborative co-decision maker and they're amplifying their skills together, their respective skills in the area of preservation? I've seen very good supportive IT departments. I've seen ones that never listen, and I've seen ones that do too much of the work without consulting the archive. Those are things we evaluate in these assessments. We think about the existing legacy media, old storage media that needs to be taken care of, had the materials on it extracted and consolidated onto digital repository storage. We think about the data management tools, which are really like the software you're using to manage digital content, create fixity checks, all that type of good digital preservation actions and work, those tools that we have at our disposal, and what storage is available. And lastly, the security around our materials. How do we authenticate users when they access our content, especially in the back end around storage, not just for the researcher? And how do we make sure that there's less of a risk of a hacking threat or malicious threats against our content? That's the full scale and scope of, oh, I'll go back one slide just before I introduce the next topic. That's the full scale and scope of an assessment. We can get pretty granular even if we are quite broad in what we cover in these assessments. And remember, if it's too much, if it takes too much time for you to work with a peer to do all of it, just doing one section is worth attempting as well. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of the tools that we have in our publications that help you get the assessment done in these facets. One thing we provide everybody with is discussion prompts for each section. Discussion prompts are really open-ended and just conversation starters, and they shouldn't be the only questions you ask in a section, but they just help the conversation get going. If we're talking about a designated community, you know, your target audience for your digital preservation program, who are you saving materials and providing materials for? We think about who uses your collections. We try to identify that group and wondering how they use them. And then also learning a bit about how they gain awareness of their digital collections for their target audience through outreach activities. Again, not the only questions you could ask, but some of the most important question starters. We then provide you with an idea bank. These are some of the recommendations or sort of suggestions to what might become a recommendation for you. They are just suggestions for improvement and they're not prioritized in any way, and you could be creative and come up with something on your own. But these have to do with maybe thinking about some good general practices that most organizations would benefit from, analyzing user statistics, documenting who their target audience is, and communicating that to the public, these types of recommendations. Now, at the end, you've got to share your findings somehow. After you've had these discussions through these interviews, there's two options that I like to present to folks. One, you could write a formal report, and we've documented this for folks, so you could take our template and use it. It takes a lot of time to write a full report though, and we've designed it really for experienced consultants. You're more than welcome to use it though, because it does have good documentation. A huge advantage to it is that no matter who is reading that report, regardless of whether or not they were at the site on the day of the site visit, the remote site visit, they're going to understand the full context of the institution because it provides a lot of background about the site visit or the remote interviews. The alternatives, though, maybe just writing an email or a few-page Word document you've converted to PDF. It could be much faster, and really turnaround can be very important for these assessments. And so there is a huge benefit to that as well. There's less documentation. You'll have to figure out how to structure it on your own. And it may not be as useful to those people who weren't there on the day that you worked with the site. But that is an option as well. We don't want to make you get stuck into thinking that the formal report that we give people is the only way that you could provide your recommendations. I want to be mindful of my time. I think I'm just about halfway through and have enough time for questions. And so I'm just going to take a second to take a sip of coffee and catch my breath a little bit and make sure that we've got enough time at the end for questions. I hope that gives you an overview of the contents of a digital preservation assessment, the areas we focus on, and some of the resources we give you to ask the right kinds of questions and help get you thinking about what the types of recommendations are that you would like to make, as well as a couple of things to think about for how you might share those recommendations. And I'll share the resources that have the template for our reports at the end. Now I'd like to jump into the ideas about doing remote assessments or remote site visits. How do we strategize around that and make sure that we get all the information we need to do a good peer assessment? I want to start with a couple of site visit truths. Very importantly, you don't need to be on site to assess digital collections effectively. There's almost no benefit to it. In the world of like preservation site visits around physical preservation, there is a real value to being able to see collections, and it can be quite cumbersome to have somebody take photographs of those materials and send them to you remotely. It can be done, but it's hard. I think there's a lot less barriers around that with our digital preservation assessments, whether you're doing it peer-to-peer or with a consultant, because we're not really looking at files on hard drives. You're talking about what files are on what hard drives. And remote site visits, they can be completed in about the same amount of time that an in-person site visit would take, just over more days. You have the freedom to expand it. And especially given how busy we all might be right now, it can be nice to be a little more flexible with that. You don't need to think the one day I've got a hotel in this town is the one day that I can do the full site visit. And lastly, the remote assessments require just as much logistical planning, if not more, than the in-person site visits. That's where a lot of the labor comes in, and I hope to give you a few strategies to make that easier. So thinking about some steps for planning a remote peer assessment, one of the first things you'd want to do is get a full list of staff, specifically around who's involved in digital content across its life cycle. You know, we're borrowing a little workflow here from the Digital Power program, which is a good training program around digital preservation, but they generally think of there being these different stages in the life cycle or workflow of digital content, from ingest, bringing it into storage, processing it, providing access to it, storing it, and then maintaining that data over time. That could involve IT. Some of this decision making might also be relevant to administration, and you might have different staff in the archive that do these elements. And so make sure you cover that full life cycle. Next, try to collect as much documentation ahead of time as you can. It's way easier to read these things ahead of time and heighten the quality of the conversation you have later. Because if you read, maybe they have a collection development policy and some procedure manuals already, maybe an accession record and a deed of gift. If you can read those ahead of time, you're more prepared to ask more specific questions that will dive deeper into your peers' practices. And it's just way easier to give recommendations on something that's been written down as opposed to something you took notes on as somebody described a procedure. So try to get that ahead of time. It could influence the types of questions you prepare for your peer. I think another important step is to start organizing staff into discrete call groups. I think for very large organizations, I've done these where it's department by department. If there's a full imaging lab, and then there's a full set of collection managers, maybe there's a digital asset manager who's got that specific role. There might be a whole department of IT staff. You might break it up into these different department groups. There's a couple of examples up there in the top right, but for smaller organizations, try to just have your peer with a couple of extra folks folded in as needed. And I'll show an example of that in a sample calendar or agenda for a remote site visit. But you might be pulling in administration, like the dean of the library at some point for a short conversation. You might pull in IT for a part of a conversation. And then for really small organizations, sometimes I just have the whole team in the department, the whole archive sitting together, and we all discuss digital preservation. But that can sometimes get a little hard to manage all the different voices that might contribute. I'm just saying it's possible. No matter what though, have your peer on the call with you at all times. It's about building trust and making sure that you're not going into your peer's site and having these conversations without them. And then also it's an opportunity for learning for them and for them to provide needed context with whoever outside of your peer that you're talking to. We'll look at what this might look like in a sample agenda in a couple of slides. For now, I've got a couple more tips. Once you've got those buckets, think about creating these top level agendas and share them with the groups ahead of time. You might use the assessment facets, or you could use maybe some more specific language if it feels appropriate. For instance, if you're working with the photography studio within a large institution, maybe you just highlight these things as things you'd like to talk about. This isn't a complex agenda. These are different areas, though, that you would definitely want answers to. It lets them know what they might need to have prepared in terms of reviewing their practices ahead of time. And it'll help keep the conversation on track. It's easy to get these things derailed. And so this will make sure that you get all the answers you want in the time that you hoped. Now, finally, one thing that you should do at the start and at the end of these remote site visits is have a kickoff meeting and a wrap-up. The kickoff is really about education. It's about educating everybody there that they are, or teaching everybody there that they are involved in digital preservation in some way, and that it takes a team approach, and it keeps everybody aware that this is a big group activity, not something where you're kind of coming in, helping out one staff member and just kind of pulling in people as needed. So builds a team, educates everybody on preservation and digital preservation needs. And then at the end, in the wrap-up, you can share some first impressions that you have, just so everybody knows where they're kind of headed, what's working well and what they might expect from a report or a letter that you send them. A couple of tools, some very practical tips for how to do these remote assessments. In terms of communication, I think we've all learned it, but video streaming is so much better than conference calls. When you're working with 3 people, 4 people on the phone, it's very hard to tell who's talking. And when you are doing an assessment, you really do need to know who says what, especially if you quote somebody. You better have that attribution accurately represented. So I would say video streaming is just more personal, but also clearer for you as the peer assessor. I'll say that doodle polls can be a great way to just show your availability and have people sign up for different opportunities, different windows to discuss, which can be good when there's large groups that you're working with. In terms of a way to share documents, email's usually fine, but if it's a large organization, Google Drive might be a little bit more effective. Everybody just throws it into a single link that maybe your point of contact shares with them. And dual screens are such a huge help. I have 3 screens here, and sometimes I don't know which one to look at when I'm doing a conference presentation. But having 2 screens at home or at your office will allow one for video sharing and one for note taking. I think it just really enhances your own efficiency doing a peer assessment. And lastly, you can use the record feature on something like Zoom. It makes it nice and easy. but never use it as the only thing, and it's not essential. I've fallen into this trap where I've thought, oh, I'll do an assessment, I'll record all my meetings, and I won't take notes. I'll be totally present and just have these nice conversations, really deep and thoughtful, and then I'll look back at the recordings if I forget something. It takes so much time to look back at those recordings and find all the information that you want to refer back to. Really, recordings are sort of a backup. You take good notes, and then if you really need specifics on what somebody said, go back to the recording. And if you don't have recordings set on, that's totally fine too. Now, in terms of an example calendar for what these assessments might look like, you could set it up where we have that nice kickoff meeting in the beginning. Oh, and I'll give a bit of context here. I'm kind of jumping ahead a little. Let's say you're working with the director of archives and special collections in a department of 2 people. They're doing all sorts of things around physical materials, but like many of us, we are starting to wear a lot of hats. Digital collections are incoming. We need to know how to handle those as well. And so for this organization, which might just be the director of archives and special collections and 1 processing archivist, what does a full peer assessment look like for them? Well, you might have a kickoff meeting at first on Monday for 30 minutes with your peer, a representative from IT, the processing archivist, and the dean. All of the different individuals here represented with your peer, the IT rep, processing archivist, and the dean. You have them in the kickoff meeting, and then you have a nice long discussion with your peer one-on-one. So that's 2 hours on Monday. The next day, or excuse me, 2 days later on Wednesday, you might work with your peer and the IT representative and have a discussion for an hour on what their storage practices are. This might be the first time your peer has really had a nice long sit down with IT about digital preservation. And so there's also some progress that can be made simply on the day by having that discussion together. The 2 might learn quite a bit from each other. Afterwards, you might have another hour discussion with the processing archivist to understand what they're doing in terms of cataloging, removable storage media and the like, or what they need to effectively process collections. On Friday, you might work with your peer one-on-one again. You might then have a meeting with the dean. Maybe you've identified some software that needs resources, of course, in terms of an annual fee or some sort, or maybe cloud storage is on the horizon for you. You might preview that with the dean and see what they think of those sort of big ticket or budget requiring items. And then lastly, you might have a wrap-up meeting to share your impressions. And this could be the full site visit. And then a month from then, you're able to have the time to synthesize your findings, or maybe a couple of weeks later, you synthesize your findings and share an email with the most important things you observed in all the assessment facets. And so that could be pulling it together for a peer assessment. I see that at this point, I've run, I think, pretty well with enough time and space for questions. Those were my primary considerations for a peer assessment. And so I'm going to pivot to resources and open up the floor to questions. And then if there aren't any questions, I might share what these resources look like by sharing my screen and showing what they look like. So at this point, I'd like to cover those resources. I might talk about them in a little more detail than I had planned because we have a good 15 minutes before we close. But I'll just double check for questions before I do that. When we look at our publications, these are your 2 resources that you can rely on. They're from 2019, and they're free. These are free handbooks or booklets that you can use. The Digital Preservation Assessment Peer Assessment booklet on the left is a user-friendly, peer-to-peer assessment model that covers all those facets. It's got the idea banks inside it. It's got the discussion prompts inside it as well, and a glossary of digital preservation terms. It is supposed to be used by individuals who do not have a professional, a robust training in digital preservation, because it provides so much good background for that type of work. Now, when it comes to the Digital Preservation Assessment Handbook, we designed that more for trained consultants who are coming to the table with digital preservation skills, but it also pretty critically has a lot of our templates also built into it. And again, this is free as well, where you can look inside and see like a pre-visit questionnaire that consultants might send to a peer or a client before the site visit, and they get a lot of good background information out of that. And it has a report template built in. And so those are the two resources here. At this point, oh, thank you, Jessica, for sharing that link. I know that with Zoom, we aren't able to always click on those during the screen share. So at this point, I'd like to open up the floor to questions, and then I would, if we don't have any, I would also be happy to screen share some of these publications to give you a better sense of what is entailed inside them.
Hi, thank you, Sean. Excellent presentation with very helpful resources for digital preservation. Now that we have the floor open for questions, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter those into the chat. Well, I'll ask a question. For a larger institution where you have multiple departments, how can you ensure that the communication is clear while you are performing a digital preservation assessment to each of those separate entities throughout, and to make sure that everyone is on the same page and informed throughout the process?
Oh, that's a good question. And so when it comes to a larger organization, there are a couple of tips that I would recommend. One, if your peer that is your primary point of contact is not an administrator above all of those different departments, then you might want to develop a closer partnership during the peer assessment process with whoever is that administrator, so that then they have a voice that can reach all of those different departments. It also adds weight and legitimacy to the assessment process, as you can imagine, scheduling all of these different meetings that take quite a bit of time. It can help then to not only work with the friend that you have that might be within the archives, but maybe that university librarian or whoever might be in charge of the multiple departments that you might be working with, and incorporate them early on into the conversation. I will say that when you are peer assessing, having that kickoff meeting with everybody involved starts the conversation and makes sure that everybody is working together as a team, and knowing that conversations are had between departments individually, but they'll all feed into a larger product, which would be an assessment report or a letter. And while it's important that everybody's communicating and aware of each other's practices, the report that you share really is that resulting document that will enhance communication between the departments, because it will include observations that you made about all of the different departments. And so if it's distributed to everybody who was involved in the peer assessment, they can read it and say, oh, I didn't know that that department was doing this. And oh, there's a recommendation here that involves this department, but also involves this department. And sometimes recommendations can be as specific as you know, encouraging better communication between departments. Does that help your answer your question, Tabitha? I feel like I touched on a few different things there.
Yeah, that was extremely helpful, and addressed it right on the head. So.
Oh, cool.
And Jessica, she has a question. She says, how do you recommend an institution find a good peer to connect with to provide a peer assessment?
Oh, that's a good question. There are a few cases where I've taught peer assessment models and I have like a sign-up sheet for everybody who's attended the workshop, but those workshops are multiple hours and, you know, provide a certain level of training, so everybody who is able to use the sign-up sheet has had some training in the peer assessment methodology that's a little longer. And so I didn't include it in this session, but that, you know, if we offer trainings like that again in the area, that could be one pathway to finding like a peer who understands the model and has some baseline understanding of digital preservation. Outside of that, I'd strongly encourage you to work through like a listserv or even through SCAA. And if you want to, I've seen good conversations in Merrick, a little further north, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference, where the conversations are so open and casual that if somebody just said, I'm looking for a peer to do a digital preservation peer assessment and would be interested to talk to anybody who works with digital preservation, you might find some buyers. So I would encourage you to try the listservs of different regional archival associations as being an opportunity. Does that help, Jessica? Okay, good. Oh, those were really good questions. I'm still here if you got any questions. And so I'll just take another sip of coffee.
Okay, well, we have just over 6 minutes. If anyone has any additional questions, or Sean, if you wanted to go through those resources, you can take a couple minutes if you wanted to. You have about just over 6 minutes to do that. So if you want to take the time to do that, or if anyone has any other questions that they want to enter into the chat, you can. And we'll be breaking at 3 for another break before our 3:15 session.
How about this? I'll do exactly, I think, what you suggested, Tabitha, but people feel free to enter a question into the chat. I can't see when people are typing, so I think what I'll do is I'll just start showing those resources. But if you still have a question, you're more than welcome to keep typing it, and I'll keep my eyes peeled for those. One thing I will say when you're looking for somebody to do an assessment, and this is not meant as a plug just for NEDCC services, but we do offer these assessments, and they can be fully funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities Preservation Assistance Grant, and we're not the only organization that would do those types of assessments too. Just want to be completely transparent on that being another option if you are interested in it but can't find a peer. So let me pull up these resources. And also I'll share that grant, because that grant is just great no matter if you're working with us or working with somebody else or want storage supplies. I think that's a really powerful grant that is currently open and available for application until January 14. Looking at these two resources, I want to highlight the peer assessment first for the last few minutes that we have here. Scrolling down a bit. Here, I'm going to just show a little bit about some of the content. There's the introduction, and it reinforces also the types of facets here. I know we went through those a little quickly, and so remember we talk about the organization in terms of its structure, in terms of its strategic planning, and how conducive that all is to supporting a digital preservation program. We think about the staffing and resources available, and the policy infrastructure and those workflows that support the activities that we need to carry out to support our digital preservation program. And lastly, what do we have in terms of storage, IT personnel, and software and tools to manage our digital content. I'm gonna go scroll down a little just to show what the introduction looks like, what you can see here when you pull it up yourself. These are what the discussion prompts look like. There's a couple of idea bank recommendations for most of them. Collections doesn't get one because we're just gathering background information on the collections here. And this is what the bulk of the document looks like throughout. For the last 3 minutes, I'm going to share the assessment handbook and just share those things that set it apart a little bit as a more advanced resource and tool. And so the assessment framework looks quite similar, but then when you get down to the templates, that's where you find a one-pager on the process of assessment, a pre-visit questionnaire, and a report. And so I'm going to scroll down to those very quickly. This is a one-pager that just talks about the process of assessment. This can get everybody on the same page about the purpose and the responsibilities of the institution involved and the consultant. You could still use this as a peer if you feel up to it and prepared enough, and just identify yourself as a consultant. So we go down here for the pre-visit questionnaire. These are the types of questions to see how they fit into the facets that we discussed: institutional profile, learning about the collection and the users, staff and resources. This is something filled out ahead of time to help elevate the conversation later. And I'm going to scroll through these. You can see the granularity and depth that we get with the types of questions even before the visit begins. And then the report. This is the report that I was talking about earlier as being a very official way to share findings. There's an executive summary attached that summarizes the points in a nice two-pager, and then we get into the content around digital collections, the institutional profile, the process of the assessment. This makes this an independently useful resource for people who weren't there on the day of the visit or the remote assessment to still know what happened. And then we look at the facets, the organization, designated community. You record observations and recommendations, those discussion prompts, what you learned during those discussions, and the idea bank. What were the recommendations that you ultimately came up with? These are some examples of what you might recommend. Just going to scroll down slowly. You'll notice one thing I want to highlight. These all come with boilerplate of good practices that just introduce a person to the concept of the section, and they act as a preamble to your observations and your recommendations when you write a report. At this point, it looks like we're at 2:59. And so I think I've shared the full content here of the templates available to you should you choose to go that route. I want to say that I really appreciate your attentiveness. I really appreciated the great questions that I got as well. And I am really glad that I got to present this here at SCAA. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Sean. We have enjoyed your presentation. And so now we are approaching our next break at 3 o'clock. And so we'll leave for that. And then our next session will be at 3:15. Please remember that session G1 has been canceled. So there's only G2. And we look forward to seeing you there. Y'all have a good break, and we'll see you at 3:15.